So as I was saying, if you look at most countries have data protection in place. The blue shows where it's in place, the red shows those that are implementing, and the lighter areas are those jurisdictions where there's not really any unified law in place at the moment. So just turning back to the EU GDPR, it's pretty broad in ambit, quite wide, and I think some might say it's too wide because it applies if the data controller, so that's the organisation collecting data, collects data from EU residents, or if the processor, that's the organisation making use of the data, or the data subject, so the person is based in the EU. So that means that if a foreign company is collecting data on EU individuals, that foreign company is subject to the GDPR, which is, as you could understand, quite far-reaching. So, as I've said, and failure to comply with this regulation has a maximum penalty of 4% of global annual revenue. So, really significant. Just to look at definitions, personal data is very widely described. I'm not going to go into it over here, but anything that's possible to identify an individual. So it doesn't have to be a name, it could be a telephone number, a pseudonym, a Twitter handle, I guess. Processing is also widely defined. I don't think one's going to find much loopholes in what would be considered processing once you have that individual data. Working with it is going to be covered by it. Again, not necessary to go into the definition, but the controller is widely defined as a natural or legal person or public authority or agency or any other body which alone or jointly determines purposes, etc., for processing or controlling the data. So let's look at the consent. The consent of the data subject is any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous consent. So it's not, I think, enough to just say, after you agree to us collecting your data, you also have to have consent to a specific use for that data. So I could collect data as a law firm on my clients, but they should know for what purpose I'm going to use that data. And noteworthy conditions are conditions for consent, and yeah, the subject should have the right to withdraw the consent at any time. So it can't be a blanket consent that could be continue forever. You also have a right to be forgotten that says, I want my data removed from your systems, and that must be then permanently removed without undue delay. And there must be privacy by design. So the controller must implement appropriate technical measures to ensure that the personal data which is necessary for the specific purpose that it was gathered is being used. There is a slight, and because I'm a bit more life sciences focused in this talk, you would understand that if you're gathering in the life sciences area data for research purposes, you might not know the exact purpose for which you're gathering the data. It might only become apparent later. So you could be gathering patient reaction data to certain drugs, and there is an exception that recognises that you might not fully be able to specify what the purpose of the use of the information is, and so you would be able to make use of this this provision. but you also have to keep it, remember that you keep it within recognized ethical standards for scientific research, and you should also give your data subjects the opportunity to give consent only to specific areas of research or parts of research. Information from registries and scientific research organizations. To facilitate research, personal data can be processed for scientific purposes, subject to appropriate conditions and safeguards. So you could also use that provision to a certain extent. I'm looking at South Africa next, and we have a piece of legislation which is the Protection of Personal Information Act, which we shortened to POPI. It's essentially based on the EU GDPR, and in many cases, both the EU GDPR and POPI would be applicable. For you, I guess the question is, so why bother about that? In the life sciences area, more than 30% of clinical trials are performed in South Africa, and so as far as pharma research and clinical trial goes, it would be important to look at this piece of legislation. Similarly to the EU GDPR, it applies to the processing of personal information. I'm not going to look at this, but maybe just look at the overlaps. Essentially, I think the biggest differentiator between the two pieces of legislation is whereas the EU GDPR applies to EU data subjects regardless of where the data is being processed. POPI, the South African Act, is really only about processing of personal information within the borders of South Africa. So it's more specific. If you gather that information outside or processed it outside of South Africa, you'd probably not fall within the ambit of POPI. Who it applies to, similarly, again, I think I'd rather leave this to you to have a look at just in the interest of time, if it was interesting to you. It's essentially personal information, and information is whatever is available to identify a subject by. Fines and penalties, the GDPR has extremely high penalties, up to 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover. That's significant. The POPI Act envisages lesser fines. They wouldn't be that significant, but criminal sanctions in the event of non-compliance, which is important for businesses, for businesses doing business in South Africa and having an office in South Africa. That compliance is important if you don't want your directors to become liable to criminal charges. Both pieces of legislation require data protection officers. The GDPR only requires the appointment of a data protection officer in certain organizations based on certain factors, whereas the POPI legislation requires this data protection officer, and that this person, in all instances, and that this person must be registered with the information regulator. Where a breach has occurred, the GDPR has very specific breach notification requirements, and these must be given. You must notify your authorities within 3 days. Whereas POPI just says as soon as reasonably possible. That leaves it open to a little bit of interpretation, but I'm thinking that you probably wouldn't want to delay too long. And so then, what does this mean for life sciences? Gathering information and data is at the heart of life sciences, and especially when conducting clinical trials. So how would this affect life sciences? I think for me the good news is life science companies have always been aware of the importance of maintaining privacy of data subjects. And so I think they would at least have the basics of compliance in place. But it doesn't mean that they are completely compliant. So what you would want to do is first of all make sure which privacy regulations and laws apply to you. You know, where is your company doing business? Where is it established? Is the office in a jurisdiction? If data is being collected, where is it being stored? Where is it being processed? And the chances are good that one would have to comply with multiple laws in multiple jurisdictions. We should also have a complete understanding of what information is considered to be personal data. For instance, pseudonymized personal data, key-coded clinical data studies, etc., all considered personal data. So probably any data that is being captured relating to an individual is personal data and would require regulation. One would want to classify one's data into different types, sensitive, highly sensitive, special categories. One would want to be aware of where the data came from, why it was collected, where it will be stored and who will have access to it, and you'd want to put controls in place and security measures in place to ensure that, for example, highly sensitive data is not accessible by the secretary in reception, and so you know, you'd be falling foul of regulations. Do you need consent? Yes. Consent is the major requirement for most regulations, and that one should make sure that this consent is in place. And you might also want to re-consent any data that you have. So, if the data was collected in the past and there was a consent in the past, you'd probably want to look at the consent that was given. And ensure that it satisfies the current requirements for consent. One wants to update one's systems to meet the accountability requirements and educate one's employees. So as I said at the beginning, a day after the GDP came into force, Google and Facebook received lawsuits. And so you want to make sure that you know which privacy laws are applicable and that you understand them. And then I'm going to wrap up. I think the message is privacy laws are probably good, but data being currency these days, there's a good argument to say, well, you're depriving me of my currency. How can I use this data, or what's the value of doing this if I can't use it? So, you know, in the life sciences area, I'm thinking many companies like the data that comes from prescribing doctors and patients. I want to know which doctors are prescribing my meds and who's using them and what conditions. All that requires consent. In terms of, I would say, the GDPR and also POPI. So how do companies grapple with this? How do they make use of it? And is it going to influence their business? I think so. And I think it's a space that's going to require much more refinement with time. Thanks.